Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Friday, May 3rd, 2019. Just a quick survey. By show of hands, how many people preferred that I actually take a nap instead of do a show today? Okay. All right, good. All right. The results are in. Looks like we're going to end up doing a show after all. Daily Coast Radio is live now. No nap. It's over. The dream has died. Kagro X, that's me. Hi. Bids you a happy TGIF, says Bill, all the way from Portland, Maine, and will now go out in the yard. Oh, this is a good idea. And play with lawn darts for 2 hours. I might not even have to play with them that long to get the rest I need. Okay. Anyway, I'll be doing it for freedom, of course, which is always the case. Always for freedom. Twirling, one might say, twirling toward freedom. Oh, look, more measles news breaking out today. Oh, okay, that's 15 hours old. My goodness, keep up, people. 10,000 people have just caught measles in a movie theater. I guess over the last couple of days, somebody has boarded at least one flight with the measles. There's a cruise ship. Oh, an interesting story. A Scientology cruise ship. Yeah, or they really have one. And it's the actual Sea Org, as a matter of fact. And their cruise ship is quarantined. Somebody has got the measles there. Somebody went, of course, to see the big popular movie in a crowded movie theater with the measles, and now everybody there thinks they may have the measles. So, it's almost as if there was some way of, we needed a description, something that accurately describes how you can accidentally or even purposefully inject a contagion into a susceptible society and see it spread rapidly from one to another. It reminds me sort of the way things spread online when things go viral. I wish there were a way of describing this in the real world, where illness spread, maybe even through the spread of a virus, and it would just sort of branch out and multiply rapidly and spread to all corners very quickly because of the nature of human interaction. But alas, we're at a loss for words, and we can probably spend a little time brainstorming on it, but no time for that. There's no time for wondering because the man is already fighting the bear. How many of you get that Saturday Night Live reference? That one's not quite a classic. Lots to share today, not all of which is directly relevant to the constitutional crisis, which is looming, but I am glad people are waking up to the fact that it's there. Although, it's a bit of a drag to have a constitutional crisis all the time. It gets tiring, and it's taking its toll. So let's see, what can we do to pass the time on this Friday? Well, let's see. First of all, we'll raise the various alarms. I saw this tweet this morning, having missed the underlying constitutional crisis, but I guess we'll drag this one out nonetheless. Steve Vladek, professor at University of Texas Law School, who brings us also a frequent contributor at Just Security and Lawfare blog, both of which have made our air several times in the past. Steve Vladek tweeting in response to a Stephen Dennis tweet. Stephen Dennis providing the coverage on this one. And again, Stephen Dennis, the Bloomberg reporter. I have to keep track of where he is at the moment. He used to be a CQ roll call reporter, is currently, and probably for 15 years, I don't know how long it's been, a Bloomberg reporter. So let's see, how shall we trace the provenance of this one? Let's go to Steve Vladek's reaction to Steve Dennis and then read Steve Dennis's tweet reporting about it. Steve begins by saying, "I can't believe this needs to be said out loud," so I'll say it out loud, "but the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee," that would be Foghorn Leghorn of South Carolina, calling the Chief Justice personally. Hello? One ringy dingy, two ringy dingies. I have a question for you, Chief Justice. I can't believe this needs to be said out loud, but the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee calling the Chief Justice personally and asking him to, quote, look into, very Trumpian language, how a lower federal court handled a series of cases is so wildly inappropriate as to almost defy description. You've described it fairly well here, but what are the particulars that we're talking about? For this, we bring you Stephen Dennis's tweets. Not Stephen Dennis. I didn't try to get him on the show. I could. We could probably chase these people down and have them come on the show and explain these things to you, but it takes too long. I don't know. His reporting is that Lindsey Graham, that's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, on Foghorn Leghorn, says he will call Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, because he's the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and ask him to look into the use of the FISA court in the 2016 election. This comes down to those nutty accusations of spying on the Trump campaign and putting bugs, by which I mean little creatures with radio. I wonder if Trump, if you ask him whether he thinks, was Trump Tower bugged? And he'll say yes. And I wonder if in his mind, those little, the reason it's called bugs is when you see cockroaches or ants in a building, they're carrying tiny microphones. And I know that sounds like dumb, and no one has ever suggested that he believed that that was the case. I'm just saying Kellyanne Conway thought the microwave had a microphone in it, maybe because they both had the word micro in it. That could be all the connection she needed. And Donald Trump is actually even dumber than she is. So you never know. Anyway, Lindsey Graham says he wants to call the Supreme Court justice to ask him to look into the use of the FISA court in the 2016 election. This, I guess, like we said, stemming from the accusation that the Obama administration was, in fact, the wrongdoer in all of 2016's election drama, and that he was directing his administration to spy on the Trump campaign for the purposes of helping Hillary Clinton win. So, Lindsey Graham, now it's his responsibility as a Republican member of Congress to take up this stupid argument as if it were real and present the following. He's going to call the Supreme Court justice and say, I heard that the Obama administration was spying on the Trump campaign and they were getting FISA warrants to do it. I want you to look into this and find out whether those FISA warrants were fishy, and did the courts hand them out to help the Obama administration as part of a vast left-wing conspiracy, which, as you know, it's no longer crazy for Republicans to accuse Democrats of participating in vast conspiracies, but it is always out of fashion and crazy for Democrats to accuse Republicans of the same. Anyway, Lindsey Graham says he wants to preserve FISA, and right now Trump is down on FISA because he thinks it was used to spy on his campaign. So we have a very complex situation developing here. Lindsey Graham, who has always been a big supporter of expanding FISA powers, despite the warnings of Democrats and others who say these expansions, and maybe even without the expansions, leave the FISA statute subject to abuse by an overreaching executive, an overreaching administration. And it's going to be a problem. And it can cause great difficulties and be very damaging to transparency, to democracy in general, in the wrong hands. And now this is something people have said for a long time, of course. And Donald Trump has never said, and Lindsey Graham has never said, because they were great believers in the FISA power, because those FISA powers were being used against punks and criminals that they didn't like very much. Or in other words, people that they didn't like very much. Whether they're punks and criminals is, of course, a subjective determination, and also a stupid one. So, for instance, spying on Quaker peace organizations because they protested the Iraq War, or investigating anti-fascists for being fascists and opting not to investigate fascists because they are not fascists, they're just anti-fascist, this sort of thing. Anyway, it's true that FISA is abusable as anything is, and it's an area that's been contentious for a long time. Like I said, it's now become very complicated. Lindsey Graham has been one of the more vocal defenders of, shall we say, loosening the controls over the use of FISA, the issuance of FISA warrants, etc., because usually what they're trying to do is catch brown Muslim terrorists, or if not that, then also maybe brown or black people that we don't like for various reasons, whether they're involved in terrorism or not. They're involved in things that are scary sounding and that make our constituencies nervous, and so therefore we got to have lots of FISA and lots of FISA powers. Donald Trump probably never got that granular about it. He just wanted to see dirty, rotten scoundrels, in his view, arrested and having their lives ruined, whether they were ever convicted or not. Now, in the course of his push for all of this, of course, Lindsey Graham was buffeted about on all sides by those who said, don't you see how rife with the possibility for abuse these expansions are? And Donald Trump, don't you see it? Of course, Donald Trump's answer was, I don't see anything. And Lindsey Graham's response was, I see what you're talking about, but it won't happen because I'm very white, and most of the people who make the decisions are also very white. We'll all figure it out. We'll make sure that the wrong people aren't targeted and that the right people are targeted. Unless, of course, it turns out that some of the right people are people that I support or who support me, in which case they will be deemed to be the wrong people, and FISA will have to be reined in. So, Stephen Dennis reporting, Lindsey Graham says he'll call the Supreme Court Justice, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Roberts, to ask him to look into this thing. So, yes, it is so wrong, as Steve Vladeck put it almost defies description. I don't know if that's immediately apparent to everyone, but yeah, I mean, there's probably some segment of the country which is, what's the problem? The chairman of the Judiciary Committee should pick up the phone and call the Chief Justice and ask him to look into whether or not some judiciary issue is being handled correctly. But of course, you'll also recall that John Roberts was the guy who calls balls and strikes, and I'm not going to answer any hypotheticals. So, of course, Lindsey's first instinct is to call him up and say, I want you to answer some hypotheticals that don't really have to do with balls and strikes so much, and figure this out. You can't just ask the Supreme Court. It doesn't matter that you're the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, except insofar as you're supposed to be the kind of person who knows that you're not supposed to do that. You can't just pick up the phone and call the Chief Justice and say, I want you to conduct this kind of investigation into whatever it is, whether it has to do with FISA or not. The Supreme Court takes cases, live cases as they come, and they don't reach down and grab cases out of the system either. You have to appeal your case all the way up to the Supreme Court and then get the Supreme Court to agree that your case presents a question worth addressing, and then they'll do it. It's not a matter of, what do you think about this whole right turn on red thing here? I got a ticket for making a right turn on red someplace, and they said there was a sign there, but I didn't see it. And I went back and looked, and it was there, but it was dirty, and you could hardly read it. And I'm a very important person. Why don't you figure this out for me, Chief Justice John Roberts? It doesn't go like that, even if it's serious like FISA. But what's been really interesting is watching other reactions to the situation, some of which are directly, impacted, and some of which are tangential. But I guess I should continue with Steve Dennis's reporting on it. So, again, the situation is Lindsey Graham thinks FISA is terrific, and that Trump is down on FISA because he thinks FISA was used to spy on his campaign. He's largely wrong about that, but he does think it. And Lindsey Graham wants to be seen as in service to whatever Donald Trump thinks. And I guess Lindsay's excuse is if Donald Trump gets down on FISA, and I don't mean like, yeah, get down, but like if he's down like I hate FISA, then that poses problems for the spying that Lindsey Graham wants to do on brown terrorist people or other nettlesome folks I don't like a whole lot. That's, of course, part of the abuse that's made possible by the system that people like Lindsey Graham have put in place and voted for. But I don't know. I guess we're supposed to accept that. And that way, he says, we're not going to catch enough terrorists. If Trump is down on FISA across the board and decides to do a presidential thing about FISA, well, then it'll be harder for us to catch people that we don't like. So that's bad. So I need to convince him that FISA is A-okay. And maybe the way I can do that is calling the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and asking him to look into that whole thing, because that's what Donald Trump would do. And maybe, not necessarily because Lindsey Graham thinks that anything substantive can come of this. It may just be he's adept at playing the Donald Trump game. Donald Trump would call and say, look into this thing. And that would be a problem for him. So I'll take that problem onto myself and I'll call the Supreme Court justice. It would be a problem for me. It's highly improper for me to do it. But I'd rather it be a controversy about me than the president. I will take that burden on. And I know very well that there's nothing that the Supreme Court can do about this at this point. But then I'll be able to point to it and say, well, Mr. President, I'm on your side. I called the Chief Justice and asked him to look into it. Oh, you did? Okay, because I was going to do that. Yeah, I know. And I saved you a lot of trouble in doing it. Yeah, great. You're my favorite guy, Lindsay. Let's go play golf. Well, Stephen Dennis had a little more to say about it. And just a little, don't worry. Lindsey Graham's quote, I guess, was, I don't intend to call the FISA judges. Do you think you were hoodwinked? That is uncomfortable for me. But I am going to ask Roberts, would you please look and see what happened? Because I don't want to lose the FISA program. Neither call would, of course, be acceptable. Neither call would result in anything in particular under normal circumstances. But you never know with Chief Justice Roberts, I guess. And, he may feel like he can act with impunity for all I know. All right. I mean, there's no indication of that so far. He's been busying himself with the role of pretending he's an institutionalist and satisfying everyone else's itches for institutionalists wherever they can find them. But I guess you might also say that means he's due for a departure anytime soon. So that's kind of weird and probably shouldn't have happened, like as in definitely shouldn't have happened. Eric Holder also uptight about things today. I don't know if it was, let me go find his tweet. I don't know if it was exactly the same thing he was talking about. I mean, there's plenty for Eric Holder to be upset and agitated about at any given moment. But I think, he's just plain angry in general at William Barr's conduct. But I think he would likely have the same reaction to what Lindsey Graham is up to. He had tweeted, Holder did, about Barr, the conduct of AG Barr over the last few weeks, and in the hearing today, which was, of course, on Tuesday, it was Wednesday now, May 1st, right? The conduct of AG Barr over the last few weeks and in the hearing on the 1st has been shown to be unacceptable. It's been shown. So there you have it. It's been shown to be unacceptable. I thought, he says, a lot of sighing in today's show, I think. I thought he was an institutionalist, committed to both the rule of law and his role as the lawyer for the American people. Now, to his credit, he says, I was very wrong. He is protecting the president. Again, heavy sigh. I mean, I don't know. I sat next to him and that meeting way back when, and this wasn't specifically the topic of discussion, but the idea that nobody warned me that Republicans could not be institutionalists anymore, that there was no such thing as a Republican institutionalist, and that they were constitutional hardball players and gimmitarians down the line. But it's entirely predictable at this point that that's the way Democrats, respond to things. Institutional Democrats think everybody else is, I guess if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're an institutionalist, you think everybody's an institutionalist. And, or you were hoping that they were. No, Barr was never an institutionalist. He wasn't an institutionalist the last couple of times he served in this institution. But this time, surely, it's weird. It's just interesting. I mean, I guess that it's their position for the sake of their argument that all the time that Barr spent in previous administrations taking apart institutions, he was doing so from an institutionalist perspective. This is how wide a range they give Republicans to operate and to call and to cover up for them by saying they're institutionalist. It's disturbing, to say the very least. And I guess the last entry in this category for the day, did I bookmark this? I don't think I did. Oh yeah, I did. What am I, stupid? All right. Well, anyway, this doesn't seem like normally the sort of material I would bookmark, but I guess I did it, knowing that I was going to need this eventually. Aaron Rupar from Vox, who does a very good job cataloging all of the various absurdities, has cataloged this one. And this will surprise no one, I think, although, I don't know, maybe the depth of it will be considered surprising. Glenn Greenwald on television with Tucker Carlson, like on the Tucker Carlson show, I guess. And wow, not his first appearance there of late. And Glenn will take, whatever television platform is handed to him and think he's going to be able to, I'll walk the straight and narrow. I'll walk the tightrope. I can present my point of view on Tucker Carlson without letting Tucker Carlson distort it for his own purposes. And this may be true of this appearance because they seem to be in agreement. Aaron Rupar featuring Glenn Greenwald's clip from Tucker Carlson saying Glenn Greenwald just made his first is it his first in studio? I thought he's been on before. His first in studio appearance. Okay. So he's done it remotely before. His first in studio appearance with white nationalist Tucker Carlson. It's true. And the purpose of it was to sell the viewpoint that William Barr was, in fact, entirely correct in his complaints about the abuse of FISA in his usage, in his demonstration of the validity of his complaints by resorting to the example of the spying in Trump Tower. He's agreed to align himself with the Trump camp on this, and I'm sure in his mind he's thinking, see, this will show everyone that I was right all along about the dangers of abuse of the FISA statute. And it could demonstrate that, I guess, again, in a normal world in which we do not live, it might be possible for a person who warned early about the possibility of abuse of FISA, the political abuse of a FISA statute. I mean, I certainly, in his earliest days, not his very earliest days, but I guess in his emergent period, remember Glenn Greenwald expressing the concern, and my agreeing with the concern, because it was a good one, a valid one, that an administration like George W. Bush's, in particular, where the unitary executive theory was widely accepted and advocated for by high-ranking officials in the Justice Department and throughout the executive branch, the idea that an administration that basically believed in a restated Nixon doctrine that if the president does it, it's not illegal. John Yoo saying, or at the very least, it would depend why the president felt he needed to do that in order for us to determine whether or not it was illegal. And that's, of course, a horrible standard because the president could say anything about why he felt he needed to do that. But it would be a very dangerous thing to leave in the hands of a unitary executive theorist, a power like anything really, but FISA in particular, where statutes like FISA, and there are many of them, where the presidential authority rests essentially on, at some level, a presidential assertion that they ought to have this authority. Like, I can spy on you if you're a terrorist. Okay, that seems like a fair statement, a fair thing to do. We don't like terrorists in this country. So then the next question for people who like the brass tacks of these things, what makes a person a terrorist? How do we know when someone's a terrorist or terrorist enough for you to be able to spy on them with greater ease under a reformed FISA, let's say, a reformed FISA Act? And the answer ultimately is, well, if there's a presidential determination that that person is a terrorist, then you could do it. Well, what is it entailed in that? Well, there's a whole process, and we got to sign a piece of paper, or maybe some parchment, and usually there are some notes that go with it, and we're advised by various offices, not necessarily the Office of Legal Counsel per se, but the various legal counsels to the departments that are behind making such determinations, and the intelligence community, etc. But it comes down to a presidential determination, which at bottom means if the president says you're a terrorist, then he can do all these things to which, or for which he would ordinarily have to resort perhaps to a court or a tougher court about these things. But now it's very easy. All you have to do is say so, and that could be very dangerous, we said. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal. Except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on it. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Let me see if I can continue this train of thought. It's allergy season. I'll interrupt the train of thought to say that, and I have something unusual that I saw fly by on Twitter to bring you later on, just to give you a real twist to the show. But as I was discussing, I think I can regain this train of thought. There was, of course, the warning during the George W. Bush administration and afterwards that leaving the expanded FISA powers and expanded surveillance powers in general in the hands of a unitary executive theoretician, if you can call any of the George W. Bush people that, was a pretty dangerous thing to do. It was a big self-executing general warrant. If I say someone is a terrorist, and yes, there's some paperwork that goes along with that, and we eventually knew we would reach the point where you would have handed the reins of power. You'd have handed the keys to the kingdom over to someone who was a believer in the unitary executive theory, but who didn't like paperwork very much and thought it was stupid and unnecessary because terrorism, come on. That you would be, you could very easily, for instance, say, well, I don't know, I'm a Republican and I, as a Republican, keep America safe. Everyone knows that this is the case because it is on all my campaign materials, and everyone believes it, including the free press, which will tell you all day long, every day, that only Republicans are interested in national security and Democrats are weak on it, and they'll reprint that, and people will read it, and they'll think that, and they'll win the presidency as Democrats and say that they need to have or they need to have Republican secretaries of defense or directors of the CIA, for instance. It's a very pervasive and pernicious thought. It seems to work pretty well. But, you'll have one day somebody who says, because I'm Republican, I believe that only Republicans properly safeguard the national security. I have, in fact, spent decades telling the free press that, and now they believe it too, and so does everybody, because everybody reads the newspaper and believes it. Okay. Well, that would necessarily mean, of course, and I don't object to, not me, I'm now speaking as the Republican in this case. I don't object because I'm a Republican, but it leads you inexorably to the conclusion that if Republicans are the only ones that know how to properly safeguard the national security, and Democrats are the only other ones there are, because that is also a thing that people think, then it must be the case, since they are rivals at all times and considered polar opposites, that if Republicans are for and all about the proper maintenance of national security, Democrats are the opposite. Democrats hate national security, hate the nation, and would like to see its security undermined, and so therefore the mere act of being a Democrat is a danger to national security. Dangers to national security, of course, must be surveilled. The new expanded FISA powers give us that ability. All we need to do is declare them to be terrorists, and we're willing to do that. In fact, I've produced 6 commercials for general television audiences which make precisely that claim, and so therefore we should be using the government's authority to surveil its citizens that are suspected of being involved in foreign entanglements that relate to terrorism or other bad things, because, bad things are bad. So we should be surveilling them. In other words, instead of breaking into Watergate and looking for their files, we should just be able to monitor them electronically because they're terrorists. And if you object to that, then you're probably a terrorist too, and how dare you? And this is how we'll do things. And everybody said, outrageous, no one would ever do such a thing. It's horrific to even think so. You're a fabulist, a fantasist, and you're taking these to crazy logical extremes that simply don't exist. All right, maybe, or then again, maybe not. And but because we were fabulous and fantasists, it occurred to many of us at the time that equally likely, just as likely as a unitary executive theorist with newly expanded abilities to designate anyone they want as a terrorist, more or less no questions asked, or at least no questions asked in a way that you, the public, will be allowed to read the questions or the answers. Both will be redacted. Despite this will not be enough for Republicans. They'll always want more. And one of the things that is ironic about this and most likely to happen because of how ironic it is, and the more everyone knows the law goes this way, the more ironic an outcome, the more likely it is to happen, especially if it happens in a way that makes Democrats look bad, because that's what we like to do. We like to do it to ourselves, I think, somehow, at some level. We all need to just sit on the couch a bit and talk about our childhood. As likely as, I thought, abuse of expanded surveillance powers by unitary executive theorists was, just slightly less likely than that, maybe, or I guess in hindsight now thinking about it, maybe that was even more likely, would be if the eventual Republican complaint that the real FISA abuse was by the Democrats who were objecting to the possibility of FISA abuse. That they were going to, because we know about them in projection, that they were eventually going to abuse the system themselves, and when caught, accused Democrats of having abused the system. And when Democrats protested that they did not abuse the system, Republicans would say, but you were always going on telling us how inevitable the abuse was. And now you're saying it's impossible to abuse FISA? No, I'm saying that you abused FISA and we didn't. Oh, really? Well, I think it was the opposite. I think it was actually you that abused FISA. How so? And then, of course, we would be stuck admitting, oh, maybe we did abuse FISA, when they pointed to the fact that, oh, well, you see, the fellow occupying the unitary executive for the past 8 years has actually been your guy, Obama. And as you know, no one's perfect. And here are a few examples of where there may have been overreach in the Obama administration. And not even necessarily FISA, restricted to FISA. You could point to any number of national security determinations that came out badly, let's say, or that even warranted and then garnered criticism from fellow Democrats. Now, knowing the seed of doubt is planted in their minds, they are able to press that a little, and I mean, it's an operation not entirely dissimilar from the sort that we at least suspected that the Russians were exploiting. They know where doubts lie and where fissures are and where schisms have opened, and they apply pressure, and they know the talking points necessary, and they're not hard to find, to drive those doubts or divisions. I'm not saying that they did this, but this would be easy enough for Republicans in this country to identify those things and to understand them and to exploit them. Well, remember, a few of you liberals thought that Obama's use of drones, for instance, and drone strikes that ended up allegedly, I guess is all you can say about it, killing innocent victims rather than the targets they were intended for, and it might not even have been on the up and up that those targets were properly determined, if you really want to get down to it. Doesn't that make you upset as a liberal? Sure, yeah, absolutely it does. Well then, how could such a regime be trusted with blah, 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 blah? I don't know. No one has ever accused them of blah, 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 blah. Well, that blah, 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 blah being the politicization of FISA to the extent that you would spy on a Republican presidential campaign in order to guarantee that people of your party retained the power that we all granted the unitary executive with respect to surveillance. You would do just about anything, wouldn't you? Well, no, we wouldn't. That's terrible. We absolutely believe in the power of the American people to make their own determination about this. Oh, really? Even if that power was being handed to Donald Trump? Well, you make a good case. I certainly wouldn't want to. And certainly in hindsight, I would say we ought to do just about anything to avoid handing that kind of power over to Donald Trump. Aha! So I have you. You admit that you would do anything to avoid handing over that power to Donald Trump. And I submit to you that that would include spying on his campaign to make sure that he lost. Okay, I will admit, against my own interest, that I would fantasize about doing something like that. But in my fantasy, well, first of all, we didn't do it. But had I fantasized about it, I would have fantasized it so that the plan came to fruition and we won. And Hillary Clinton was president and you weren't. And I would judge that to be a good thing, I guess, in your fantasy, even if I had cheated to do it. But that's actually a testament to how bad you are and how abusive you are of the system, more so than me, because, of course, in the end, we did not do that thing. All we have here are your fantasies about how much I would like to, and that seems to be enough for you to simply claim that we did after that. That's problematic. That was the problem I was actually telling you about the first time. Now, instead of being able to use the presidential prerogative to determine whether or not someone is a terrorist, you can instead use the presidential prerogative to determine whether or not somebody else is guilty of the crime you imagine they would very much like to have committed. And that seems to be enough. And based on that, not only are you under arrest, but we are going to, I guess you could be, if you're Donald Trump in this, we're going to enlist Glenn Greenwald against you, which is not a hard thing to do either, another Fisher that's very easy to read, and say he was always, or he has at least of late, been a big critic of the Democratic establishment anyway, and lots of you laughed at him, and now we'll give him the opportunity to be ultimately right about this whole thing if he'll simply join us in the supposition that both sides do it and that you did it last, and that the great fear of whatever you would call this faction, the great fear of this faction that believed that either party was just as likely to perpetrate exactly the same abuse of the FISA system was all true, and that we happened to have, even though it was equally likely of both Republicans and Democrats, and since the, say, 9/11, the George W. Bush administration has occupied the White House. There are two Republican administrations have occupied the White House versus one Democratic administration. So since both sides are likely to do it, the Republicans, I guess, statistically speaking, would be twice as likely to have availed themselves of the opportunity to abuse the system than are Democrats. All things being equal, I suppose. Though it's so rarely the case that all things are equal. But remember, that's the supposition here. Both sides, so all things are supposedly equal here. Republicans have had twice the opportunity to abuse the system. It used to be the case, once upon a time, that Glenn Greenwald would have told you, oh, I was absolutely being abused by the George W. Bush administration. Then it was the case that he would absolutely have told you that it was being abused by the Obama administration, and they both might be true. It is, I don't know, I haven't asked Glenn Greenwald whether he would agree that it is absolutely true that it is being abused by the Trump administration as well, but for the purposes of his argument, he decided to show up on Tucker Carlson's show, where Tucker Carlson would at the very least insist, no, it's not possible that the Trump administration is abusing this. Abuse is the provenance of prior presidents, specifically Barack Obama. Okay, well, all things being equal, both sides doing it and yada yada. What about George W. Bush? To which Tucker Carlson would say, no, George W. Bush didn't abuse it. And I imagine it's even possible that Glenn Greenwald, asked that question by Tucker Carlson, would say, well, there I disagree with you, Tucker. But it would be, of course, too late. Microphone would then be turned off. Thanks for coming on the show to implicate Barack Obama, Glenn Greenwald. And he may or may not at that point object. My argument has been mischaracterized. But that is where we now stand. The best possible light you can cast on Glenn Greenwald's appearance is that he was there because of his insistence that all American regimes abuse surveillance powers and national security powers in general. And that because that's the case, I don't know. I guess for some reason, the weight still belongs on the Obama administration here, maybe because nobody has yet presented specifics of how the Trump administration has abused the same system. We can be sure, in theory, that they're abusing it at some level because both sides do it, and all things being equal, we can expect that he's been involved in exactly that kind of underhandedness. It's just that no one has shown us the FISA underhandedness yet. And that's what we're talking about here, just to keep a lid on things here and keep the discussion limited to a manageable size, which we've failed to do. We just don't have reporting about Trump's abuse of FISA. However, when it does materialize, I will tell you that that is because the corporate press has been instructed to to report on it, and true independent press, like I guess I'm Glenn in this, have not seen that evidence yet. And so if it doesn't exist, they'd have to invent it. So they did, and so therefore something's... it's a very sad situation we find ourselves in. However, it does feel a little familiar and a little frustrating. I wish I could recall what context it was in which I made the suggestion, but I do feel fairly confident that at some point in the distant past of my blogging, I worried early about the very possibility that we would end up, that all of the objections that we were making to the possibility of abuse of power, whether under FISA or any other facet of the national security state, that it would eventually come to pass that Republicans would be the ones doing the accusing of Democrats. And when they did it, it would not end up being that teachable moment. In other words, even if the abuse was true and Democrats had in fact been perpetrating that abuse for political purposes against Republicans, there would never be a moment where Democrats, having said, the tables could one day be turned on you. You might not be in power. You might not be in the majority. You might not occupy the White House. And this kind of latitude for a unitary executive could become very dangerous. A Democrat could use this against you. And they laugh and say, that would never happen. I don't know why a Republican, for the sake of getting the policy through, I guess the Republicans would have find themselves in the awkward position of arguing that Democrats would never do this to us. And then they'd go ahead and grant that power to a Republican president. Eventually, power changes hands. Democrats now supposedly wield that power, but Democrats being Democrats, rank and file Democrats say, well, we should be the ones to refrain from abusing this power. We don't believe in these same strange theories of governance that Republicans have at their core. We're not going to do that. And so we find ourselves with a 4 or 8 year respite, possibly, maybe we're wrong about this, a 4 to 8 year respite for the Constitution, for our understanding of the normal constitutional order, the separation of powers as between co-equal branches, which hasn't really been the case for a long time, and most people have kind of slowly become executive supremacists in this thinking, and certainly Donald Trump did very early on. But my worry then was that I guess if you entertained the possibility that, expanding presidential powers could come back to bite you, you might even think, well, as a last-ditch effort to get you Republicans to refrain from endorsing and legalizing this terribly, at least potentially abusive changes, these abusive practices under the new revised FISA Act to the president, in order to get you to hold off from doing it, let me scare you and tell you, what if a Democrat has this power to use against you? And a normal group of people might have said, that's an interesting point. Let me see if I can imagine that. And if I can't, let's say it one day came to pass that at least the accusation was made that Democrats were doing this, whether or not they were actually doing this. Wouldn't Republicans then say, if they were normal people, aha, you know what? I just realized this power can be abused very badly because it's happening to me right now, to my Republican Party, at the hands of Democrats. This makes me furious. So far, that's a familiar sounding thing, even if the thing hasn't been done. Certainly, the suspicion among Republicans that it has been done and been done by Democrats is easy to recognize. We've seen that before, and I guess here Democrats would then say, they'd be hoping for this. Aha, well, now we have the first teachable moment here. Republicans are finally outraged about how far a president can go with the national security apparatus, even if he politicizes, or maybe especially if he politicizes the national security apparatus. He could use it against Republicans. And now we have an example of, at least, of Republicans thinking that that has happened to them. And we will pounce upon this moment and say, see, it's very dangerous. We should work together in bipartisan fashion to rein this in so that it doesn't happen to anyone anymore. At which point we, to our great disappointment, find that Republicans say, no, it's interesting that you should say so, but I draw a very different conclusion about this, which is that Democrats abuse the national security system, and probably because they're degenerates and hate national security and hate the nation. And so we should rein in the Democrats' ability to use this power. Republicans are the ones who use it responsibly. And it has come to pass, after protesting about all the dangers of being able to politicize the process, and swearing, whether truthfully or not, that we wouldn't do that because we know it is bad with a capital B. The Republicans, I don't know whether they really believe it or whether they simply enjoy the irony of accusing Democrats of it so much as a trolling tactic that they simply can't resist, or maybe they just don't know what's going on psychologically behind all of this, if that's really what's happening. And maybe the theory is wrong. I don't know. But I do recall somewhere along the line saying the great irony of having pointed all this out and having had our advice rejected by Republicans is that we have planted in their heads the seeds of the very argument that will, one, carry the day for them, and two, make us wring our hands and scratch our heads and think maybe we did do this because we're such contemplative folk. And they are very much the opposite. And here we are. It's finally happening. And even knowing that ahead of time, having posited this very theory, I still have to sit here and say, well, maybe we did, because we bombed those weddings, and I don't know, maybe we spied on Trump Tower after all. And I'm sure that the argument could be presented that we did, and it was largely because, well, Trump Tower is, as I've said, the Mos Eisley space station of Earth. It's a hive of villainy, scum and villainy, and there are organized crime bosses on practically every floor. I would be shocked if there weren't several active FISA warrants at all times in Trump Tower, in and around Trump Tower. Of course, and I mean FISA warrants because, of course, a lot of them are Russian mobsters. Now, for our own homegrown mobsters, and I guess it's still of interest to us somehow to differentiate between foreign and domestic terrorists and foreign and domestic mobsters, although I don't know why exactly. But there was once a reason. We're probably also surveilling them, just not under FISA, under the authority of other law here in the United States. Okay. So that's, I don't know, that's the theory of what's going on. That's, I guess, how you can try and explain the complicated news ecosystem in which Glenn Greenwald is griping about what he's griping about, Eric Holder is griping about what he's griping about, Lindsey Graham griping about what he's griping about, and all of them, I don't know, circling this same system, pointing with great suspicion at everybody else, but in the case of Democrats, possibly also at ourselves. I don't know. It's a very complex situation, like I said. Not easy to straighten out on the fly either. Let's take a look at some of the comments that others have forwarded about this issue, and it's been some time here. Let's see. Sponson chiming in here. Let's see. I'm going to have to scroll back a little bit because there's a couple comments. Let's see. Is this one the first here? Even though it's sometimes abused in other ways, Sponson says, FISA wasn't the vehicle for any surveillance of domestic anti-war or anti-fascist groups. Target has to be foreign. True. FISA was not necessarily the vehicle there, although I guess it's entirely possible, particularly under, well, I don't know. It's entirely possible that someone could have sworn out an affidavit. Now, this would be interesting. Here's another great irony, I guess, if you want to speculate. What if you were swearing out a warrant that the peace groups or anti-fascist groups are in fact motivated by foreign trolling, like we suspect is the case inside Trump world? That because I mean that's a theory that's been discussed before, long before we ever had a show. It was the common theory among mostly fringy right-wing types. But like Trumpism, it too eventually seeped into mainstream Republicanism. The idea that the dirty, rotten hippies and peaceniks were in fact being directed by, Russia was pervasive. And that being against the Vietnam War was an inherently communist thing to do. I'm not really sure how that ever was part of the economic planning, but somehow it worked to convince the conservatives here in the United States that the only reason that the stupid long-haired hippies were against the war in Vietnam was that they were in fact pro-communist, because of course we were fighting against the domino theory and international communism, and the only way you could have opposed America's interests in Vietnam was if you were a communist. And so maybe we ought to be surveilling you under FISA, because clearly the Russians were getting their message to you somehow. And that sounded all ridiculous to this was my initial problem actually with Trump-Russia in the early days after the election. Some of you probably recall those days when I thought, this is terribly archaic sounding. Isn't this old, like, right-wing theory? Weird. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I guess we'll continue theorizing. He follows up, Sponson does, the first comment by letting us know that the F in FISA stands for foreign. Of course, it does. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, which oversees the administration of FISA warrants. Yes, I'm aware of that. And of course, also, I guess we're all aware that particularly during the George W. Bush administration, that too was subject to a lot of manipulation and was a pliable term, and questions arose over whether or not, I guess the FISA warrants were easier to get, generally speaking, and when it came to electronic communications, particularly email, the difficulty sometimes in differentiating between foreign and entirely domestic communications was difficult, because email and electronic information packets were traveling various strange routes. They might have been going between American nationals, but if one was overseas at the time and it was being carried by a foreign carrier, or sometimes someone was, of course, the classic example of the loophole is an American communicating with a foreigner in a foreign country, which is what FISA was more or less designed for. But, it became a pliable standard, and I think it was abused in so doing, but there were certainly cases, it seems to me, in which we were discussing publicly the known fact that they were seeking to bend the definitions in various cases in order to preserve evidence that the government insisted they had seized properly under FISA and the FISA amendments post 9/11, and it wasn't entirely clear to the rest of us that they were being honest brokers and all of that. But then it should also be noted that, yes, there's plenty of domestic surveillance abuse going on as well, and it may very well be the case that the bulk of the information being gathered about peace groups and anti-fascist groups was being gathered without the help of FISA. I don't think that it's most people's contention that FISA produced most of it, but I think it's not outside of the common contention that similar abuses and similar excuses about national security concerns drove governments, American governments, to bend and manipulate all sorts of surveillance authorities in order to get the information that they wanted. I believe there's more commentary here from Sponson before I switch over to Michael Musson's comments. Yes, here's another. The purpose of a John Roberts investigation, Sponson speculates, would be to delay a result that is bad for Trump as long as possible. And then parenthetically, you add here, FISA was not abused at all against Trump campaign, just as it was with Barr delaying the release of the Mueller report. Okay, I don't even know if that's necessarily the purpose of a John Roberts investigate, to delay a result that's bad for Trump as long as possible. What, you mean the result that someone, and I don't even know who, finds that FISA was not abused with respect to the Trump campaign? I mean, has Mueller, is the idea that Mueller has reached such a conclusion, and the idea of asking for an investigation is to hit the pause button on this and freeze it in place and leave, that could be, leave people in doubt, the media chiefly, in doubt as to whether or not they would be warranted in simply asserting, as Mueller did, that there was no abuse with respect to the Trump campaign, and that this would leave it an open question. And some say that there was abuse and we'll just have to leave it there. I could see that. I suppose that does make a certain amount of sense, assuming that was what you were saying. I think so. It makes more sense to me that way if that wasn't what you were saying. But, to be fair, we'll open up to the possibility that I've misinterpreted. Now over to Michael Musson, whose comment was, while Roberts is at it, why doesn't he have the Supreme Court start investigating anything it pleases? We can call it certiorari a priori, or something. Yeah, okay, like pre-crime in that crazy movie that I never did finally see, that Minority Report movie. I'm way behind. You see, I'm not going to get to Avengers for a long time if I go in chronological order. But yeah, tongue-in-cheek there. I mean, at that point, why not let Roberts just start calling balls and strikes? Well, you don't even need to organize a baseball game. He's just going to walk through town saying, that's a ball, that's a strike, that's a ball, that's a strike. Actually, that stupid balls and strikes thing struck me earlier today. Like, I wasn't really sure. I was trying to make a joke about what Roberts would say about Lindsey Graham saying he was going to call him and ask him to look into the use of the FISA court in the 2016 election. And so he's got to call a ball or strike on that one. And I was like, okay, well, the joke will be that Lindsey Graham says he's going to call John Roberts. John Roberts, what do you think about this? And I said, he would say, ball one. Like, okay, and this is where it struck me. Well, would he say strike one or ball one? I mean, okay, there's many layers of the joke here. It's not a funny joke. It just has a lot of layers. Lindsey Graham says he's going to call the Supreme Court, going to call the Chief Justice. I want you to look into the FISA thing. Is the joke John Roberts is on board with the Republican program, and so therefore when we say, wait a minute, Lindsey Graham is going to call you and ask you to do this thing and investigate the FISA court? That's ridiculous. Tell us how ridiculous that is, John Roberts, and the assumption is that John Roberts would say, strike one against you, Lindsey Graham. You don't understand the Constitution. Strike one against you, Trump administration and Trump lackeys. You don't understand how things work around here. No, we're not going to let you get away with that nonsense. No, the Supreme Court doesn't do that sort of thing at all for anyone, least of all for you. We have integrity. Strike one. It's a strike against you. That's what a normal person would say in this position. Maybe, although really maybe a normal person in this position would remain silent and say, I'm not participating in this stupid game at all. But since you call balls and strikes and you have integrity, now you have to tell us whether this is a ball or a strike. And a person with integrity would say it's a strike against the Trump administration. But a person without integrity, like maybe, I don't know, John Roberts, would say it's so obviously a strike that I am going to call it a ball. I'm going to just audaciously assert that it's a ball. Everyone saw it was a strike. It was right down the middle. Obvious strike. The television replay makes it clear. But I say ball one because I'm on Team Trump. That's the joke. But wait a second. Ball is a bad pitch. Like a good pitch would be a strike. It's bad for the person batting. I guess the problem here is I suddenly realize you're calling balls and strikes, but I don't even know who the batter is. Not only was it a dumb thing to say, I'm not biased, I just call balls and strikes. That's my job. I call balls and strikes. But all of a sudden, you realize that in this context, or any context, it doesn't make any sense. I don't know what a ball means. I don't know what a strike means. I know what it means in baseball, but this isn't baseball. I don't know who you are. I don't know who you're calling it on. Is a strike a good thing? Like, we're going to have the Supreme Court justice investigate whether or not FISA was abused against the Trump campaign. Strike one. Okay, but as against who? Like, are you saying, no, the assertion that the Supreme Court would, could, should do such a thing is bad? Strike against you. Or is it Lindsey Graham is the pitcher and has said, I am pitching the idea that the Supreme Court could, would, should do such a thing, and that they absolutely will reach the conclusion I have, which is that this was an abuse by the Obama administration, who politicized the system and used it against Republicans because reasons. To which John Roberts says, yes, strike. It was well pitched, straight down the middle. No one could lay a bat on that one, and it's a strike. In fact, it's 3 strikes. And someone here is out. We just don't know who it is. You see, the weakness of the metaphor is being demonstrated here. I don't know what to make of calling balls and strikes because you don't know who you're calling them on behalf of, particularly when you have a hypothetical in front of you like this. And this is probably the reason, one of many, why courts don't give, or the Supreme Court anyway, doesn't give advisory opinions and take up hypotheticals. And I suppose why they try not to answer they really aren't answering hypotheticals in their confirmation hearings because they don't want to give anybody ammunition to use against them. They want to be confirmed and get a lifetime appointment. And then they'll entertain all the hypotheticals they want. There's nothing you can do about it then unless you're ready to impeach them, and we all know how that goes. We've been following that bouncing ball for a little while as well. So calling balls and strikes, I don't even know who, in the context of a baseball game, the context is obvious. We know who's batting. You can see him right there. We know who's pitching. You can see him right there. I don't know who is pitching, who's batting, who's catching, who's on first, for instance. I have no idea. And even that is a confusing thing. Who's on first? Haha, we all know what that means. No, really? What does it mean? Who's on first? Who's playing first base? Or who is the runner currently on first? I don't know. That's different context. Yeah, right. I don't know. Third base. See, we have a lot of problems. This is a terrible metaphor. We all knew it at the time. But that's, I don't know. I guess that's sort of beside the point. If anything can be beside this point at this point. It was a bad metaphor, and you should never have made it. And the problem is, we don't know how crazy you are. Or maybe you feel like you owe it now. Like I did this balancing act, and at the time it was politically prudent for me to save the Affordable Care Act from total destruction, and so I did it, and that made my conservative patrons mad. Now I have to hand one back. Maybe, I think the appropriate one, the less inappropriate, perhaps, maybe, of the several things that he could hand back to a Trump administration to mollify conservatives. Not that you're supposed to be doing that. You're supposed to be calling balls and strikes, but we saw how that went. It would be to say, all right, well, I'm with you on the next Affordable Care Act ruling or something. That would be the corrective ruling, as opposed to say, all right, well, the Democrats got one. Now Republicans need to get one for me in order to keep things fair and balanced so that everyone still thinks I'm calling balls and strikes, even though no one knows what that means. So the thing I'll hand you is, I don't know, the total obliteration of Article 3 and maybe the entirety of the Constitution. The Supreme Court will now start entertaining, personally, the Chief Justice will start entertaining personal calls to offer speculative opinions on hypotheticals about, of all things, the national security apparatus. Let's just expose that to view. Why don't you? By having a phone call. And of course, you're exposing it to view. You can't keep it secret. It can't be a secret negotiation because this is the most transparent administration ever. And also, by the way, the youngest. He declared himself a very young, vibrant guy not that long ago. And not even sure really how to interpret that one, because I think he did end his comments. Maybe it's just a slip of the tongue that he said, I'm the youngest person. He's literally, this is another episode of How to Read a Trump Comment. He said, I'm the youngest person. He didn't finish the sentence. Youngest person what? To occupy the presidency? That's what we're talking about here. That was the context. You are, in fact, not just not the youngest person, but in fact the oldest person to have been elected to the presidency. I think we established that a while ago, because numbers, they're facts. But maybe they're not. They're not when they're describing your weight, so I don't see why they should be facts when they're describing your age either. I tell you, the world today is a complex place. It's very difficult to follow along. This might be the worst show ever. I now realize 3/4 of the way through it. Could be the greatest. Not really sure how we're doing on that. All right. Change directions. Is anything a change of direction after an inquiry like this? I don't think so. How are we going to deal with the rest of the show? Let's see. I don't think we need to change direction. I think it's all the same direction. How about more craziness? This feels like a change in direction, but if the direction is craziness, then it's really not. Think progress. I have a lot going on in my head about that one, but just the fact that I'm reading from Think Progress is telling me a lot. The author here is just gives the first initial, D. Parvaz. I don't know what D stands for. Does that tell us anywhere? Curious. Maybe it's down at the bottom. Probably not. Sorry, D. I'd love to give you, this is the credit you asked for, right? Your byline on here. D. Parvaz telling us this. Just, again, to shift gears from crazy to crazy. Trump considers military options in Venezuela. I'm already freaking out, but don't freak out yet because there's more to come. Trump considers military options in Venezuela that experts say will freak out the hemisphere. The whole hemisphere. It's not just you liberal hippie bastards, but the whole hemisphere is going to get freaked out by this. This is what's on the table. If you took your eye off of Venezuela for a minute, you would have missed this. Rolling in with soldiers is one thing. It makes me worry about what the rest of this sentence says. I'm not looking. I'm not going to spoil it. No spoilers. Rolling in with soldiers is one thing. Well, what's crazier than that? Wouldn't rolling in with soldiers freak out the hemisphere? Maybe just part of the hemisphere? The whole hemisphere? What would freak us out? Rolling in with soldiers is one thing. Stabilizing Venezuela is another. Well, that would be crazy. Not even sure where that leads. Let's look. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro addressed 4,000 troops. That's not going to be enough to stop us. You know that. In a televised message on Thursday, saying that they must be prepared to fight the traitors, and that's in scare quotes, supporting opposition leader Juan, how does he say this? Guaido. Juan Guaido's failed attempt to take power this week. Again? Yes, I guess they haven't settled this. How many dead would there be? This is a quote. How many dead would there be if a civil war started here in Venezuela? Because of the foolishness of coup mongers, I didn't know that could be mongered, but coup mongers and traitors. And how long would the war last if there was an invasion? A week. It's probably the answer. Because we would never surrender, said Maduro, who has been accused of fraud and corruption by his critics. And you know how deadly those fraud and corruption accusations can be. They're a fat lot of good they're doing us here. It's been 3 days since clashes erupted between Venezuelan security forces and protesters supporting the opposition leader, Juan Guaido. I got to get used to that. Guaido, whom the United States and over 50 other countries recognize as the country's interim president. Don't get me started on that, but there you have it. I mean, we did observe that this happened, yes? Despite assurances from Guaido, I mean, that's what the letters say. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Or, I mean, Spanish is pretty straightforward. One thing I appreciate about Spanish language, if that's what the letters say, that's how you pronounce it. It's not like English or French. Despite assurances from Guaido that, and the Trump administration, and you know what you can do with those, that it was over for Maduro. However, I'm going to have to reemphasize this. Despite assurances from Guaido and the Trump administration that it was over for Maduro, however, it's clear that that's not the case. Someone knows how to read a Trump comment. Maduro still maintains the office of the presidency, and he has called Guaido's attempt a failed coup, which I guess if he still maintains the office of the presidency, it is. On Thursday, how is it? I guess this would be last Thursday. News is slow in arriving from Venezuela. Where were we here? On Venezuelan president, we read this. All the pictures have moved around here, so it was difficult to see where we left off. On Thursday, Maduro tweeted an image of himself marching with military commanders to signal his resolve. Looks a little silly, but okay. It's embedded in here. You can take a look. So, what can the United States do now? Who do you mean by United States? Think progress? Let's find out. President Donald Trump, some people think he's the United States. He thinks he's the United States. President Donald Trump, along with high-ranking members of his administration, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton, have maintained a hard line on Venezuela. Both Pompeo and Bolton say a military option is on the table, pointing not only to Maduro's refusal to step down, but also to Russian and Cuban support for his regime as justification. See, we're still confused about Russia and Cuba and all of that. Russia is our friend. Cuba is apparently not our friend. Russia was communist. Cuba is communist. Russia and Cuba still sort of on the same page, not because of communism so much as because, what? Tradition, and Russians, though no longer communist, are making plenty of money somehow with their relationship with Cuba, because Cuba's an emerging market for tourism, and tourism is a great place because of hotels and condo rentals, etc., to launder money. I don't know. But there you have it. But Russia, despite having flipped its entire political and economic system on its head, has done a terrific job, I guess from their perspective, maintaining relationships date from their Soviet days, as with Syria and Cuba. And how interesting that they've also been able to, at the same time, convince American conservatives that Russia is a friend and that it's someone we ought to be cooperating with, despite the fact that having thrown off communism and having become, I guess you could even say, hyper-capitalist, like hyper-crony capitalist, hyper-corrupt, oligarchic mobster capitalist, despite having, gone to the opposite extreme from its Soviet communism, it maintains the same relationships that used to be based on those premises with its previous allies, and the only country that has changed its perspective on Russia in terms of considering it an enemy or an ally is the United States. It's a very odd situation. Okay, but here we are. Pompeo and Bolton both say a military option is on the table, reason being that Russia and Cuba support Maduro. Is it Maduro? Maduro. They just a typo. All of a sudden, this one showed up without the R. I'm like, oh my God, have I been inserting an R in Maduro's name? No, it's Maduro. You see how you make me doubt myself. Think progress. Trump also threatened to apply maximum sanctions, and you know what he thinks that means. Not really. A full and complete embargo, as it turns out, though. He tweeted on Tuesday, unless Cuba, the subject of another of our full and complete embargoes, except for the parts which we no longer embargo, unless Cuba immediately ceases its support of Maduro. But we don't care about Russia? Maybe. I could see Trump doing that, right? Could that be a mistake, too? A typo, almost, just leaving Russia out? And if so, is it Think Progress or is it Trump? You got to go back to the original source. You got to show me the paperwork on all this. Trump threatened maximum sanctions against Venezuela unless Cuba ceases its support for Maduro, but we don't want to make Russia angry, so we don't mention them. Okay. Reuters also reported that Eric Prince, still in the news, the billionaire founder of the infamous military contractor Blackwater, was pitching a plan to trigger regime change in Venezuela, which I assume means his getting paid for triggering that regime change and maybe even enforcing that regime change. The Pentagon has been cautious about any plan for military intervention in a country of roughly 33 million. Yeah, good point. With U.S. Southern Command Chief Navy Admiral Craig Fowler telling the House Armed Services Committee on Wednesday that any transition, quote, should be a democratic transition, which would necessarily mean, I think, that, Admiral, you wouldn't be there, right? Because that would not be he's trying to say, I guess, that they're not for military intervention. For comment on that, we'll go to our Secretary of Defense, who is nobody. We don't have one of those, and we haven't had one for months. But hey, whatever. We have an acting Secretary of Defense. It's merely acting, but he's able to do it just beautifully, I'm sure. A spokesperson for Fowler later issued a statement saying, our leadership has been very clear that all options are on the table, although a peaceful transition to democracy in Venezuela is preferred. So he actually kind of got in trouble for saying, we should hope that the outcome is reached peacefully and through democratic means. No, you got to get back in there and remind everybody that we could invade. All right, well, the leadership, the civilian leadership that I'm supposed to be responsible to says that war needs to be on the table. So here I am, reluctantly, as the Navy, saying, yeah, man, all right. The civilian leadership wants us to remind you that a military solution could happen. And we were supposed to say that we like civilian ones, but military too, just in case you had any doubts about that. Okay. Next section we'll begin with before taking our break. Venezuela as the next Iraq. How do you like that? There is pretty much no chance at all things will end well in the case of a U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. I think that's fair. Said Adam Isaacson, Senior Associate for Regional Security Policy at the Washington Office on Latin America. WOLA, Washington Office on Latin America. Did you know that there was such a thing? When asked about worst and best case scenarios for such a move, Isaacson said there really is no best case scenario, and that the worst case scenario would start with days of bloodshed and end with the Venezuelan military putting down their arms. And then the real trouble would start. Think Iraq after the 2003 invasion created a power vacuum and the mass instability and insecurity that persist. You could think about that if you remember such a thing. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Shall we continue freaking out the entire hemisphere by talking about war in Venezuela? Sure, why not? What harm can come from freaking out all of the hemisphere? At that point, we were talking to, what's his name? Isaacson here, Adam Isaacson of the Washington Office on Latin America. At that point, after such an invasion, and then, of course, the power vacuum and mass instability and insecurity that persist after the surrender of the Venezuelan military, presumably, at that point, you would have a large number of people participating in the colectivos, that is, an irregular paramilitary organization, a colectivo, supporting Maduro. In other words, a Fedayeen Maduro of sorts. And the militia, which supposedly has like 500,000 members, Isaac said. But hell, even if 10% of them show up, you have the ELN in Colombia, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, a guerrilla group operating in Colombia. You'd have organized crime groups. You'd have retrograde elements of the military. By the way, the participation of organized crime groups, good news for Russia and John McCain, I guess, since everything's good news for him. Even in death, organized crime groups, maybe that's why, that's where Russia remains involved. Though Cuba, I don't know, Cuba be upset by that? I have no idea. You'd have retrograde elements of the military. You'd have probably several dozen thousand people with at least some training in arms acting as a guerrilla or terrorist resistance, knowing that the United States would not want a long-term presence, which would be disastrous on so many levels. But we would probably end up with one anyway. Just thought I'd throw that in there at the end. Two former deputy assistant secretaries for defense in Latin America, Frank Mora and Rebecca Chavez, have said that military intervention in Venezuela would require between 100,000 and 150,000 U.S. troops for a significant period of time, dealing with asymmetrical war, or 10 Marine Todds could probably get the job done, according to Trump world. And this doesn't take into account the spillover into neighboring Colombia, because a conflict of that size would be hard to contain, and there is no precedent for a U.S. military intervention on that scale. But who cares, right? It would freak out the region, the entire hemisphere, in ways we haven't even thought about. The whole order that we've had of free trade agreements and the OAS, the Organization of American States, and good diplomatic relations, better than war anyway. Very few interstate conflicts or border disputes. All of that would just go out the window, said Isaacson. Benjamin Gedan, senior advisor at the Wilson Center's Latin America program. I don't know whether he's Gedan, Gedan, or like almost Israeli, Gedan. Benjamin Gedan, let's say, at the Wilson Center for Latin American Program, said over email that even in a best-case scenario, what the United States would be looking at is inheriting, quote, a failed state unable to provide food, medical care, and basic services such as water and electricity. The country's infrastructure is in a shambles, with a U.S. invasion or strike only carrying with it the promise of more destruction. You'd be hard-pressed to find any security experts, including at the Pentagon, eager to invade Venezuela, he said. Also, I guess it adds the fact that Gedan is also National Security Council's South America Director under the Obama administration. Seems like an awkward time to add that note, but okay. What about the sanctions? In a war, Isaacson points out, one side is defeated, but there will be a lot of folks who still reject the military outcome, who still have guns, ammunition, and funding. So absent war, what other instruments is the Trump administration using? Right now, U.S. sanctions aren't explicitly asking for regime change, although they do demand new elections. Isaacson said that, quote, implies regime change because it's based on the illegitimacy of last year's elections, unquote. That could mean Maduro's supporters might fall away as they are targeted by individual sanctions, although this strategy has not yet yielded results. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's sanctions hitting the country's oil company are expected largely to hurt ordinary Venezuelans and cause massive hardship for people who have no power in the present situation. Although people say the same thing about our Cuba sanctions. So that will probably bother no one who's pro-sanctions. The only way out, Isaacson offered, is a negotiation, not war. Luckily, we have the negotiator president, right? It's strange that he doesn't want to do any negotiating on this. In a negotiation, you get almost everybody to buy in, and everybody has to give something. But ultimately, everyone has attached themselves to a solution in some way, he said. The best solution, he said, would be a non-military one in which all sides realize that they don't hold a strong hand and get serious about negotiations that lead to free and fair elections. And there's some transitional justice scheme, and they manage to thread this very difficult needle without any more bloodshed or insecurity. That'd be great. Venezuela has plunged into chaos as protests against Maduro have intensified over the past 2 years. With the currency in freefall and hyperinflation at play, millions of people have fled the country, which has been facing major food and medical shortages. It is possible the White House understands these risks and merely threatens an invasion to scare Venezuela's generals and provoke a mutiny against Nicolas Maduro, said Gedan. But this psychological warfare is not without costs. The Latin American coalition opposed to the Venezuelan regime steadfastly opposes U.S. military action as well, and the Trump administration's rhetoric alienates critical allies. Who needs them, right? That's the Trump way. All right, shifting gears again, there's plenty more that we ought to be discussing, and I don't know which one is going to be the best use of our time. I'll mention a bunch of things for your reading interest over the weekend, but in terms of priority, I'm going to pass, believe it or not, on a Charlie Savage article in the New York Times, The Coming Subpoena Fights Between Trump and Congress Explained, on the premise that we have explained them plenty already, and it'll be interesting to see whether our thinking comports with Charlie Savage's. Passing two for the moment, though I could double back on any of these things, is the question posed in the Washington Post by Amber Phillips. Is Nancy Pelosi greasing the skids for impeachment, record scratch, of Barr? Good question. Maybe. And it seems like she's been sort of forced into the corner of admitting that we might be at that impeachable moment and that maybe for whatever reason politically she's more comfortable with the impeachment of someone else, anyone else, and hoping that the rest of the caucus likewise will be satisfied with the impeachment of anyone else, and maybe Barr is a good stand-in. for Trump. And she may be, I guess the idea is she may be considering that as somehow less politically damaging, though I imagine she will approach the impeachment of either of them in much the same way. Investigate all you want, and then let me know what happens and where we stand. Then, let's see. We have two pieces in the Atlantic, both of which appear to be very important, but I'm going to go with the second of the two. The first is Quinta Jurecic, writing under the headline, All of the Impeachable Offenses, which sounds like a good litany of them, and it's good to lay them out. And the premise being that the ones we've been focusing on of late aren't even, I don't think, don't even represent the majority of the universe of impeachable offenses. Focusing on the Mueller report, she says, alone risks leaving out the obvious. Maybe we'll be able to turn around and get back to that one. I'm setting that aside for the moment in preference of Adam Serwer's The Dangerous Ideas of Bill Barr. Since if there are skids being greased and those skids are for Bill Barr's impeachment, we might do well to focus on those issues first. The Attorney General's theory of executive power places presidents above the law. I feel like we've discussed this. Adam Serwer writes for us, one of the stranger aspects of the Donald Trump era, really, is the open competition for the president's affection. From Fox Business's Lou Dobbs saying that Trump's presidency is, quote, the most accomplished in modern history. There's an ellipsis in there. To the president forcing his cabinet secretaries to praise him on camera to his former fixer, praise him on camera, probably I would say comma, to his former fixer Michael Cohen once declaring that he would, quote, take a bullet for his former employer. It seems like each of the president's myrmidons. Is it myrmidons? Looks like myrmidons because there's like there's not an I in there. Myrmidons, and I'll tell you offhand the definition escapes me, but in context I think we're all getting the sense of what that means. Each of the presidents, these things, myrmidons, okay, is daily attempting to outdo the others in employing Soviet-style hyperbole in praise of the president. Poor Soviets. They're getting beat up on today, huh? If there's a comfort in this spectacle, it's in the recognition that this is performance, that it's a shtick, and that its ubiquity is a marker of the president's deep insecurity. True. And weakness. Okay, so where were we here? I've gotten a text that has distracted me. Stop texting me, people. Not you guys. It's not you. Don't you start, but I'm not blaming you. It's not a projection of strength, but one of weakness. The performativity of the spectacle suggests that at least some of these people recognize they are doing a bit. Others seem to have been corrupted by their proximity to Trump. Career civil servants such as Rod Rosenstein, who swore oaths to uphold the Constitution, so what, have somehow been reduced to shuddering with fear at the thought of being fired in a tweet begging the president for the opportunity to ensure that the law bends to his will. I have been surprised about that. You get paid pretty good as whatever it is he is, Deputy Attorney General of the United States, but it's not a CEO gig. In the days of income inequality like this, we learn from afar to sneer at jobs that pay a mere, let's say, $180,000. Fantastic amount of money, right? But in the CEO era, who cares, right? The golden CEO era, that should be peanuts. So you do wonder about things like that. Like, okay, Rod Rosenstein shuddering at the thought of losing his job. You could go into private practice. You don't have to be a CEO. Go into private practice as an attorney. You'll make 3 times that immediately. But okay, he likes the job. Whatever. No one wants to be fired. That's just basic. Anyway, Adam continues here. And, all right, thanks, everybody, for continuing to text me during the show. All right, that's annoying. It's still not you. It's my family. They forget. It should be clear from Wednesday's hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee that William Barr, the Attorney General of the United States, is something else entirely. Barr is no flunky. He is a hardened ideologue, yes, who believes that the president he serves, or any president he serves really, is largely above the law. Barr seems genuinely committed to defending the imperial prerogatives of the office against short-sighted liberals who would weaken the presidency in a delusional quest to remove a Republican from office. I guess opponents to the imperial prerogatives of the office like, let's say, Glenn Greenwald, who for some reason is arguing the opposite at the moment. As he put it in his 2017 memo attacking the special counsel's investigation, crediting the beliefs, that's in scare quotes, crediting the belief that the president could have committed obstruction by his official acts would have grave consequences far beyond the immediate confines of this case and would do lasting damage to the presidency and to the administration of law within the executive branch. Barr is not protecting Trump because he thinks Trump is the most accomplished president in modern history, because he fears Trump, because the real estate mogul has some psychological hold on him, or because he has been corrupted. Barr is defending Trump because Barr is a zealot. In March, Barr released a letter summarizing the long-awaited conclusions of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's inquiry into Russian interference into the election. You know all about that. The letter mischaracterized Mueller's conclusion that the Trump campaign took advantage of and benefited from Russian interference, only quoting the part of Mueller's report that found that the Trump campaign officials' conduct did not amount to a prosecutable crime. Barr also misleadingly framed Mueller's discussion of obstruction of justice in order to reach a conclusion that Trump did not obstruct, even though Mueller all but suggested that Trump would have been indicted if the Department of Justice did not have a policy against prosecuting a sitting president. Tuesday evening, the news broke that Mueller had written a letter expressing frustration with Barr's effort to mislead the public about the conclusions of his investigation after watching days of credulous press coverage suggesting that the president had been exonerated. On Wednesday, before the Senate, Barr elaborated on his decision-making. Barr not only defended his decision to clear the president of obstruction despite the fact that the public watched the president fire the FBI director over the Russia investigation, dangle pardons before suspects, and intimidate witnesses, but insisted that the president could not have obstructed justice simply by shutting down the investigation because the president does not have to sit there constitutionally and allow it to run its course. The president could terminate the proceeding and it would not be a corrupt intent because he was being falsely accused. The logic here is breathtaking. The president can end an investigation on the basis that he is falsely accused. The entire point of an investigation is to determine culpability. If the president can end an investigation into himself or any of his allies simply by asserting his own innocence, then he is effectively above the law. Similarly, of course, in an earlier part of the show, if the president can open an investigation into any of his enemies simply by asserting that they're terrorists, then he's effectively a dictator, even if not above the law, because in that case, happily enough, the law gives you that precise right. Isn't that odd? Under this standard, though, the standard by which he can simply acquit himself, President Richard Nixon was perfectly within his rights when he attempted to end the investigation into the break-in of the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate, which implicated several of his campaign operatives and ultimately led to his resignation. Of course, there really are people who still believe that. And one of them, by the way, always relitigating Watergate, is Dick Cheney, who I hear Joe Biden says he's good friends with and gets along with pretty well. So that's going to go over huge. Barr has previously suggested investigating the officials involved in the Trump inquiry for wrongdoing. On Wednesday, he was evasive when Senator Kamala Harris asked whether the White House had ever asked him to prosecute anyone. Should Trump demand that his attorney general prosecute the next Democratic nominee for president, for instance, there's little evidence that Barr would be any kind of obstacle, even though he's an institutionalist. The attorney general is sworn to uphold the Constitution, not act like a mob enforcer against the president's political enemies. Unfortunately, who gives a crap, says Bill Barr. Nixon famously declared it in 1977 in an interview with the reporter David Frost that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. That was not mere sophistry, but ideology. And it is an ideological strain that has run through nearly every Republican administration since Nixon. Yeah, I kind of wrote that one already. Barr's involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal helps illuminate his conduct today. The administration of President Ronald Reagan defied federal law by selling arms to Iran in order to fund right-wing guerrillas in Central America, where we no longer have any current problems. A scandal that has led to the appointment of an independent counsel, and that did lead, rather, to the appointment of an independent counsel and the convictions of several high-ranking administration officials. When George H.W. Bush took office, he, of course, pardoned 6 officials implicated by the investigation at Barr's urging. The Iran-Contra scandal itself speaks to the conception of executive power to which Barr subscribes, that a president can do whatever he wants, even if Congress bars him from doing so, particularly if he is acting in what he believes to be the interests of the country. Trump is famously incapable of distinguishing between national interests and personal ones, between loyalty to him and loyalty to the nation. Let me pause here for just a second, reiterating that first part of the sentence. The Iran-Contra scandal itself speaks to the conception of executive power to which Barr subscribes, that a president can do whatever he wants, if he's a Republican, even if Congress bars him from doing so, particularly when acting in what he believes is to be the interests of the country. That's why it's okay if you're a Republican and not okay if you're a Democrat. Everyone knows the definition of Republicans. Republicans are the party who are interested in preserving the national security of the United States, and Democrats are the opponents of American national security. Indeed, the opponents of America itself, and so that goes a long way towards, it's not that it's okay if you're a Republican. It's okay if you're a super duper patriot who believes in America. That equals Republican, as we all know. And the opposite of that equals Democrat. And so therefore, you can spy on Democrats. Or if Democrats wield power from the White House and are interested in doing something that would otherwise be illegal, but for that person being the president, that act remains illegal and impeachable because Democrat. Because obviously it's not in the interest of the United States. I told you at the outset that Democrats oppose the national security of the United States. Weren't you listening? Now, Adam continues, as Reagan's former national security advisor Robert McFarlane put it, Reagan, quote, just didn't believe that it was a legitimate authority of the Congress to say that, to bar the president from doing things. That he, rather than Congress, determined how we would conduct, in this case, the support of freedom fighters. This has been particularly true of the expansive conservative conception of the president's constitutional war-making powers. If Reagan openly defied Congress and the law, the first President Bush ratified his actions by pardoning those involved in the scheme. The next Republican president, George W. Bush, covertly defied the law by building a network of secret prisons across the globe, indefinitely imprisoning those suspected of terrorism, and sanctioning warrantless surveillance of American citizens, all based on dubious legal theories that amounted to little more than Nixon's insistence that the president is above the law. Less articulate was the former George W. Bush Justice Department official John Hughes' response to being asked whether the president could, and I apologize for reminding you of the context, could order a child's testicles crushed. And his answer, which I cited to you earlier without reminding you of the context, was, I think it depends on why the president thinks he needs to do that. A pretty extreme answer. But, he's teaching kids what the law is at UC Berkeley right now. This theory of executive power does not apply to Democratic presidents. I'm no longer editorializing. This is Adam actually saying that now. This theory of executive power does not apply to Democratic presidents who become tyrannical figures the moment they take office. But that's for the best. even if the skepticism is partisan in origin. Preventing the powers of the president from growing too vast to meaningfully constrain is in the public interest. But what is at work with Barr is something more perilous than the sort of bizarre partisan overstatement that characterizes much of the Trump-era conservative discourse. The thing about the Trump sycophants is that at a certain point, the praise becomes so effusive that it feels, if not quite insincere, aware of its own absurdity. If someone is committed to the president as Cohen once was, can flip and tell Republicans in Congress, I'm responsible for your silliness because I did the same thing that you're doing now for 10 years. It suggests that when the time comes, the pageantry can be discarded, that the grift can be abandoned once it is no longer profitable. Barr is not Cohen. He is not doing a bit. He is not grifting. He is not performing. He is not a suck-up or an opportunist or a lackey. He has not been compromised or corrupted. He is an ideologue who, like many of his Republican predecessors, believes that Republican presidents can do whatever they want, regardless of what Congress, the law, or the Constitution says, and that makes him far more dangerous. And it's true, and we could expound on that for ages. I guess one more example that I sometimes bring back to bear every once in a while, the example of the George W. Bush administration saying, for instance, when Congress threatened at some point to defund the Iraq War, just as Congress threatened to eliminate the president's authority to conduct the Yemen war, this president's current conduct of the Yemen war. And the president said no to it and vetoed it. Now, at least this went through a normal process. But back in the day when George W. Bush was threatened with the defunding of the Iraq war, their response, the George W. Bush administration's response, was simply, well, we would just defy that directive. We would simply say, you don't have the authority to tell us to do that. And well, what if you went to court and said that we do have the authority to do that? Of course, his attorney general at the time, Alberto Gonzales, said, judges, what are you talking about? Judges don't have the authority to tell the president of the United States what he can and cannot do on the question of national security. They're not qualified to make such decisions. I mean, all the dangers were there. All the same threats to democracy were made. And many people actually recognized them too. Even newspaper people did. It wasn't like newspaper people are always blind to it. Charlie Savage, who I passed on reading his article, absolutely recognized it. It's a little bit frustrating, I guess, at this point to be talking to people who are saying, yeah, this is a unique moment in American history. It's not a unique moment in American history. And a lot of us have said as much, and a lot of you have agreed too, that that Trumpism isn't different in kind or origin or anything from mainstream Republicanism. And I guess this just reinforces the point. We have been at this dangerous juncture for the past several decades, every time a Republican administration is installed in the White House. And only to a certain extent, I guess, are Democratic regimes relief from any of that. Okay, so that means I end the show, I guess, with a shot at Democratic institutionalists of the institutional Democratic Party. And does that mean I'm signing on with Bernie Sanders and or Glenn Greenwald or both? And the answer is no. I think we were pretty clear about how we're feeling about where Glenn is at the moment. Let me just throw this one at you, just for a total switch. For something to contemplate over the weekend. No sources on this one except personal experience. I've mentioned to you before that I worked on Bernie Sanders' first Senate campaign back in 2006. And what else was I working on back in 2006? Well, of course, the answer to that is pushing for wider recognition, at the very least, of the propriety of impeaching George W. Bush over his many constitutional violations. Because, of course, we were at the same juncture with him that we are at now. I don't know. Fewer people think so because George W. Bush's hair wasn't as funny and he didn't paint himself orange. Anyway, at the time, I and many of our left-leaning friends, including many of you, believed that George W. Bush ought to be impeached, and I worked for it in a very odd way. As a matter of fact, we were organizing among state legislatures, trying to push for them to back up their congressional delegations making a direct proposal of impeachment on the House floor, which only eventually did eventually happen. But anyways, many of you may have remembered that we were pushing in Vermont to do this, where the Vermont legislature was overwhelmingly Democratic. The thing is that Bernie Sanders was at the time running for the Senate and was looking to get the Democratic nomination for that. And as it turns out, brave advocate for the truth that he can sometimes be, while the progressive left was all for the impeachment of George W. Bush, he had a very legitimate fear, a political fear, that if he were to endorse such a move, the Democratic Party in Vermont would be afraid and would withhold its nomination for the Senate from him.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
So in other words, rather than cast himself as an impeachment proponent in support of the progressive factors in Vermont, despite the objections of the Democratic establishment in Vermont, Bernie Sanders actually did exactly the same thing in the interest of pursuing his election. Just something to think about over the weekend. We'll be back on Monday.